A couple quick announcements. We have some literature in the back of the room afterwards if you're interested. And we also have a new lot of t-shirts. If you're interested, t-shirts are $10. There are also some odd sizes and strange colors of sweatshirts that we have on special sale for $5 each. So we'd love to not haul those around. If you like a sweatshirt, please take a look at them. But the reason we're here tonight is to celebrate Darwin's birthday, which is, of course, the 12th. All these years we've been talking about evolution. We've been talking about how we have evolved from a single-celled organism to an amazing, complex creature, how we are a eusocial being. And tonight, to talk about this, we have Brad Ericson. Brad has driven here from Kearney to be with us tonight. He got his bachelor's degree at University of Kearney when it was then Kearney State College, and then he got his Ph.D. at Baylor College of Medicine. Brad came back to Kearney in 1989 and has been there since. He's risen through the ranks. I'm very pleased to say that Brad is a member of the National Center for Science Education, Nebraska Citizens for Science, American Associations for the Advancement of Science, and Sigma Chi. He has a great publication record. He is involved in keeping the undergraduates excited about science, which is a fantastic thing. And I am so very pleased that he can be here with us tonight. Thank you, Brad.
Fantastic. Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so very much for that introduction, Lori. And again, I want to thank Reason for inviting me to give the Darwin Day presentation. Of course, as Lori already mentioned, 207 years ago. So let's go ahead and go to the first slide here. 207 years ago, Charles Darwin was born. And since it's the political season, I would be a little remiss if I didn't also mention one other rather famous individual born on the same day, same year, and that's Abraham Lincoln. Now, it's interesting to note that Abraham Lincoln established the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. In that way, I always think of Lincoln and Darwin being having some close ties in terms of truly loving science. Now, you'll note that Darwin was a bit of a prodigy. He entered med school at age 16. Okay, and he learned while there taxidermy from a freed black slave. It's a rather interesting side note because Darwin is often falsely accused of being a racist by creationists. So it'd be rather difficult to explain why he would take lessons from a freed black slave if that were really true. However, med school was not Darwin's calling, and so in 1827 he switches his educational course and begins studying for the clergy at Christ College. Now, while there, he actually occupied the very room that was occupied by William Paley. Now, some of you may know who William Paley is. He is the individual that creationists love to cite over and over and over again as using the original watchmaker argument. And again, if you're not real familiar with the watchmaker argument, the idea is that if you were walking along a beach and you found a watch, you pick it up, the complexity of the watch would imply a watchmaker. Okay, and so that is where that argument originally comes from, and of all people to actually occupy that so-called dorm room, shall we say, would be Charles Darwin. In 1828, he attended John Henslow's lectures on botany, and it was at this point that he became extremely passionate about science. Now, myself being more of an animal person, a molecular biologist, plants wouldn't have done that for me, but I'm glad they did it for Darwin. In 1831, he graduates from Cambridge, and then later that same year is when he goes on his famous voyage on HMS Beagle. And, of course, during that time, he makes a huge number of observations that would play into his formulating the idea of evolution, followed by the theory of natural selection. And for a huge span of time, so 23 years, he works on showing how evolution works. And ultimately, this results in November, I believe, of 1859, when On the Origin of Species is published. And that book, the entire set of books that was published from that first printing is sold out in one day. So rather impressive. I wish I could write a book and have every copy sell in one day. Okay, in fact, I think there's quite a few authors out there that would like that. But one caveat that I have to mention is on June 18, 1858, he receives a letter from Russell Wallace, in which Wallace, in essence, describes natural selection. So Darwin wasn't the only person to come to this conclusion. And in fact, receiving that letter is oftentimes what's credited to getting Darwin to get moving and finally finish writing on the origin of species. A couple years later, once the impact that Darwin's work is starting to have on the societal forces of the day start to come to bear a little bit, the rather famous Huxley-Wilberforce debate takes place. Now, Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog. And was a very stout defender of Darwin's work, whereas Reverend Wilberforce was a creationist and was doing his best to discredit Darwin. And in fact, he enlisted the premier anatomist of the day in Professor Owen to try to also discredit the theory that Darwin had put forth. Then on April 19, 1882, Charles Darwin dies and is buried at Westminster Abbey alongside another rather famous Englishman, Isaac Newton. Okay, so why do I care about a talk like this? And this slide and the next one are going to explain why. First of all, let me say that I'm not going to present evidence for atoms. Okay, because that's already proven, that's well established. Don't need to present evidence for atoms. I don't need to present evidence for disease-causing organisms either. Okay? Very well established that those concepts are obviously major drivers of scientific research and have been for well over 100 years. Evolution, interestingly enough, was accepted 50 years before those two theories, atomic theory and germ theory. Okay? And yet, in a recent survey carried out by the AAAS, say perhaps not all that recent now, is done in 2005. Out of 34 countries, okay, the United States finished 33rd in the general population's acceptance of evolution as being true. At least we beat Turkey. Now, why is this so? And, the short answer is that it's religiously motivated. And that's really the only conclusion you can come to. Okay, is that this is the rationale. When you examine the countries that fully accept it, they fall very high on the secular scale as opposed to the religious scale. And so as a result, various individuals are constantly trying to displace evolution from the schools. Now, there has been some improvement since 2005. So this was a survey done in 2013. It's a Pew poll. If we take a look at the answer given to the percent of U.S. adults saying humans have existed in present form since the beginning, and this has been a rather stubborn number, actually, that 1/3 has been rather constant through poll after poll after poll for at least 40, 50 years. But this portion has actually improved, and we've taken it from the don't know or refuse to answer slice of the pie. Okay, so 60% of the U.S. population now agrees with the statement, humans have evolved over time. However, unfortunately, there's a little bit of a caveat to this slice of the pie as well. When we look at a further breakdown of this 60%, what we find is that 32% attribute it solely to natural processes, whereas 24% believe that a supreme being is guiding evolution. That would be kind of like your intelligent designers out there, or as I like to call them, creationists 2.0. And of course, Ken Ham's efforts continue. Those of you that may not be familiar with who Ken Ham is, he's the individual that runs the Creation Museum in Kentucky and has now managed to raise the funds to build a full-scale model of Noah's Ark. Okay, so the title of my talk is Why Evolution is True. So I feel that I need to relay what I mean by truth, okay, or what scientists mean by truth. Okay, so truth, an assertion for which there is so much evidence that it would be perverse to deny it. Okay. So again, I've already touched on the atomic theory and germ theory, but a couple of others, gravitational theory. Okay, I was just watching an episode of Star Trek the other night, and Spock says, I can drop an axe and I don't have to watch it hit the ground. I know it did. Okay, and then Big Bang theory, and evolution and the theory of natural selection. So what is evolution then? Okay, so evolution literally means change over time. But the biological definition is the change of allele frequencies over time. So again, for those of you that may not be all that versed in science, although I know a number of you are, an allele is simply an alternate form of a gene. Okay, so for example, if we have an allele for purple flowers on the, shall we say, paternal chromosome, and an allele for white flowers on the maternal chromosome, okay, note that the two different forms of the gene fall at the identical position on each chromosome. Okay, and as a result, the phenotype of this individual will be driven by whichever of these alleles is dominant. In this case, it's the allele for purple. So you'll end up with all purple flowers, even though you have a gene for white flowers. Now, evolution is based on several common sense observations. First, all organisms produce more offspring than are capable of surviving. Okay? So anyone that's ever raised a crop knows this. Because you're having to constantly deal with insect pests. Of course, they reproduce themselves in huge numbers. And as a result, of course, not all of those offspring are going to survive, especially when you apply a pesticide of some type. Okay? But those that do, unfortunately, are going to be the driving force for future resistance to that pesticide. Selective forces are provided by the environment in which these organisms find themselves. Okay? So again, this was the genius, shall we say, that was co-discovered by both Wallace and Darwin. Those organisms best adapted to the given environment survive and pass on their genes to the next generation, and this is what we refer to as natural selection. These genes, that is, allele frequencies, then increase in the general population. Now, several key points in understanding evolution. So, evolution itself. Okay, so over many generations, a species can evolve into something quite different. And this is driven by DNA mutations followed by selection either for or against those mutations. So animals and plants alive today weren't around in the distant past. They're descended from earlier ancestors. Now all species evolve, but not at the same rate. This is dictated by the evolutionary pressures they experience. So, for example, horseshoe crabs and ginkgo trees have barely changed over millions of years, whereas whales and humans have evolved at a very rapid rate. And we'll take a look in particular at whales here a little bit later on. Other key concept is gradualism. So it takes hundreds to thousands, even millions of generations for such changes to occur. So, for example, evolution of birds from reptiles. Now, some change can be very quick, such as in microbes, but this is dictated by the fact that a lot of microbes have very short generation times. In fact, I just talked about this to my microbiology class this morning. Okay, I made them guess what the shortest length of time it would take for a microbe to divide. So most of them were guessing in hours. I said, "Oh, you're way too long." Okay, we need to talk in minutes. Okay, so 20 minutes can be a generation time for some microbes. And of course, this accounts for the rapid rise of drug resistance in these organisms. Now, once a species becomes well adapted to its environment, evolution tends to, quote-unquote, slow down. Okay. Why would that be? Because we've removed these selective forces, right? Okay, so we remove the selective forces, and the organism is now happy without needing a great deal of additional change. Although change does continue as a result of genetics. Okay, speciation. So all living things share some fundamental traits. So the biochemical pathways that produce energy, the standard four-letter genetic DNA code, and translation of that code into proteins. So what this tells us And this is something that I read by one of my favorite authors many, many years ago, Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov was the first person that clarified this concept for me biochemically. But he made the observation in one of his books that because of the biochemistry alone, we could deduce that evolution is true. And because of these processes being universally shared. Now, what this ultimately leads to is an organism that we refer to as LUCA. Okay, and LUCA stands for the last universal common ancestor. And so at one time, LUCA was the man. Okay, so evolution meant gradual genetic change within a species. Then we would have only one highly evolved species. Then the individuals that opine, why do we still have monkeys? Okay, if humans evolved from ape-like ancestors, they'd be right. We wouldn't. Okay, there'd just be one highly evolved species. But that's not how things work. Okay, we have more than 10 million described species and 250,000 fossil species, and it's estimated that this 10 million is probably on the order of about 2%. So we've got a long way to go in terms of describing the total number of species on the planet. All right, so how does speciation work? Well, let's take a look at a evolutionary tree for the dinosaurs. And I've marked a couple of key points on the tree with an X and a Y here. So X represents a common ancestor that would have split into all of these extinct species of dinosaurs here, and this branch of the tree ultimately leading to birds. Okay, so your raptors, of course, are, in terms of the dinosaurs, are all extinct. So, along the tree leading up to birds, okay, we had further branching. So the intermediate ancestor that gave rise to Tyrannosaurus versus birds, okay, would have been at approximately this position on the tree. So the big question is, what happens to drive speciation? Why does X become 2X, shall we say? Okay? And so the surprising answer to that question is not much. Two populations began living in different places. They evolved sufficient genetic differences such that they no longer could interbreed. So perhaps the offspring may be sterile. And we can, I always forget which way this goes. Tim may be able to help me, but it's horse with donkey, right? Gives the sterile mule, or is it horse with mule gives the sterile donkey?
Horse donkey.
Horse donkey, thank you. Okay. I always forget which way that goes. Okay, so we know of examples of this. Okay, if we're talking about plants, okay, flowering may occur at different times. Okay, etc. So there's a multitude of routes, okay, by which sufficient change can occur just simply by separating populations. And of course, over time, these differences gradually grow larger. So if we were interested, for example, in the evolution of the vertebrates. So at this point down here would be our common ancestor for all the various lineages of vertebrates that we observe today, or some that are extinct. And at one point along this tree, we had to have an ancestor that was the progenitor for 4 legs. And I've been fortunate enough to actually have seen at least one of these, and actually held the very fossil bones in my hands when I visited Neil Shubin's lab last year about this time. It was in March last year. And the fossil that Neil Shubin discovered was tectonic. And I'll be coming back to a tectonic here in a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to play a little game with the audience now. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to take these 4 terms, and I want you to, in your mind, don't shout it out, okay, just in your mind, organize them from most important to least important. Okay, so I'll give you a couple seconds here. Okay, everybody got it in their mind, how they'd organize them? Okay, so here's how scientists organize them. Okay, so theories, laws, hypotheses, facts. Okay, so who managed to organize those correctly? Or at least the way a scientist would? No one. I stumped. Oh, Tim did. Oh, Tim, you cheater. You've seen this before. Okay, so I managed to stump the audience. That's good and bad, I suppose. Okay, so why do scientists organize these terms in this fashion? Well, the reason is that theories hold the greatest degree of explanatory power. Okay, this is then followed by laws, then followed by hypotheses, and at the very bottom is facts. Now think about how the typical layperson would organize these. Okay? So they would typically take facts, put them at the top. They'd probably have laws here, theories here, and hypotheses there. They would typically be the routes by which those would be organized by the typical layperson. Okay? So I want you to just think of a fact, okay, such as water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. But does that explain why it boils at 100 degrees centigrade? No, it just tells us it boils at 100 degrees. We need the theory of thermodynamics, okay, to understand why water boils at 100 degrees. And that's why theories are at the top. Okay? Those are what provide the explanatory power. Now, evolutionists have been very clear about this distinction from the beginning. And this is part of the disinformation campaign that we constantly get bombarded with by creationists, is trying to obfuscate the meaning of the word theory. So we clearly acknowledged, okay, or clearly have acknowledged that these mechanisms are anything but complete, or completely understood, and that evolution, okay, is a fact, okay, whereas understanding the mechanism by which evolution occurs, i.e. a theory, is natural selection. Okay, and those were Darwin's 2 great and separate accomplishments. Okay, establishing the fact of evolution and proposing a theory, natural selection, to explain its mechanism. So, is natural selection only a theory? Okay, I imagine some of you have heard this before. Okay, using the word only in that particular phrase. And of course, the implication is that there's something that is wrong or not quite right with a theory, that's mere speculation and very likely wrong. Okay? So 2 key points. So as we've already described, okay, theory in science is much more than mere speculation. It is a well thought out group of propositions meant to explain facts, and most importantly, for scientific, it must be testable, make verifiable predictions, and be falsifiable. Okay, so predictions. So if evolution is true, then what we would predict to find in the fossil record is the following. We should find in the oldest layers of rocks more simple types of organisms. As we proceed up the geologic column, that is toward ever younger rocks, what we should find is an increasing level of organismic complexity. And as we approach modern day times, the fossils should be ever closer resembling to modern day organisms. Okay, is this indeed what we find? Yes, it is. Okay, this is exactly what we find. And it doesn't matter where in the world you look. This is exactly what we find. Okay? Nothing can upset me more quickly than somebody saying, oh, the fossil record is BS. And unfortunately, I've heard that a few times. So anyway, and along the way, okay, as we observe these various fossils, and we'll take a look at a couple of examples here in just a moment, what we're also going to see is some species changing over time, forming lineages showing what is described as descent with modification, i.e. adaptation. Okay, some other predictions. So we should find cases of speciation in the fossil record as well as in the wild. We should find examples of species that link together major groups suspected to have common ancestry, that is, birds with reptiles, fish with amphibians, etc. In addition, these transitional forms should occur in layers of rock that date to the time when the groups are supposed to have diverged. We should expect species to show genetic variation. We should see natural selection in the wild. And we should see imperfection. Okay, this would be a mark of evolution, not design. So let's take a look at one rather well-studied example of the evolution of a horse. So if we start approximately 40 million years ago with Eohippus, you'll note that Eohippus is a rather small mammal, and when you examine the legs of Eohippus, what we find is 5 digits. Certainly nothing like what we see with modern-day horses. 30 million years ago with Mesohippus, okay, the size is starting to increase. And note that we now have an enlarged medial tarsal, and our flanking tarsals are starting to become less pronounced. 15 million years ago with Mesohippus, okay, again an increase in size. Note that the medial tarsal is now becoming very dense, okay, much more pronounced. And we have further shrinkage of the flanking tarsals. And this continues with Pliohippus until we reach the modern horse. And note that the modern horse now just has our most prominent medial tarsal. And it's now referred to as the cannon bone, okay, as opposed to tarsal. Or have we completely lost the medial tarsals? If we look carefully, what we find are what are now split bones, okay, that are now internal, okay, and immediately flank the third metacarpal or cannon bone. These are the remnants, okay, of the tarsals that we saw in the earlier species of horses. original fossils that were intermediates between tetrapods and fish. Okay? Now, from the previous fossil record, he knew what age of rocks to search, and it's relatively straightforward what to do. Okay, so you simply know when you see fish only. Okay, what age of rocks do you see fish only? Okay, that's about 380 million years ago. And what age of rocks do you start to see amphibians? It's about 360 million years ago. So, not only do you have to take into account the age of the rocks, you also have to take into account continental drift. Okay, that is, where were those rock beds 380 to 360 million years ago? Well, the rock beds that he was looking at that time period were near the equator. Okay, where are they now? Well, they're 80 degrees north, okay, comprising Ellesmere Island. Okay, so quite a journey for those particular fossils. Now, it took him 5 years, but he found one of the most spectacular intermediate fossils ever described in the form of Tiktaalik. And Tiktaalik had features that included lungs, still had small gills, okay, had wrists, changes in the middle ear, eyes on the top of the head. So again, think about fish. The eyes are here, right? Not on the top of the head, okay? And formation of wrist bones and a mobile neck. And this illustrates one of the fossils of Tiktaalik that was found. So again, note the eyes on top of the head. We've got a clear neck area here. It's difficult to make out any of the leg bones from this particular fossil. But again, if we look at the evolutionary tree for the vertebrate limb, what we find are these various fish species, and note the gradual migration of the eyes to the top of the head as we reach Tiktaalik. Okay, and then Echinostega and Ichthyostega. Okay, so again, note the transition of all of these features leading to Ichthyostega, which has very pronounced vertebrate limbs. So the next time you're looking at your arm or your leg, think about its origin. Okay, fish fin bones. Absolutely amazing. And of course, when we do some comparative anatomy between the modern-day vertebrate species, what we find is one bone, followed by two bones, followed by lots of bones, followed by digits. And it doesn't matter if we're looking at human or lizard or cat or whale or bat. Okay, so note how the digits have become pronounced for the back wing. Okay, or frog. Of course, with bird, we've had fusion of a couple of the digits to each other. And again, one bone, two bones, lots of bones, digits. Dinosaur to bird transition. Okay, what features would we expect? Well, in a transitional form, we would expect to still have teeth. And so, an interesting question that I will oftentimes ask students is, do chickens have teeth? What do you think? Do chickens have teeth?
They have the genes for it.
Right, that's the key. That's the key. They don't have what we would call true teeth, but they do have the genes for it. Okay? And that to me seems to be a huge problem for creationists to explain. You know, why would organisms that no longer have teeth have genes for teeth? We would expect them to have claws, and we'd expect to have a long bony tail. And so again, the question arises, do chickens have tails? Well, they have tail feathers, but they don't actually have a bony tail. Unless, during the embryonic stages, you do like Jack Porter's group has been doing, and treat them with the right proteins that drive various developmental features, and voila, you turn on Okay, but nevertheless, you can turn those genes on and produce a true bony tail. Again, these fossils must appear at the right time in the fossil record. And so enter a couple of fossil examples, Trianguloraptor and Archaeopteryx. So this is an artist's conception of Trianguloraptor. Note the claws, okay, that are present, and here's the actual fossil. Okay, so you can see claws right here. Okay, it's not shown here, but this animal has teeth. Okay, and then this is a true bony tail, not just tail feathers. And similar features with Archaeopteryx. So again, note the claws. Okay, we have here, they do show it having teeth. Again, we have tailbone. So again, beautiful transitional fossils. Just beautiful. But perhaps one of Darwin's greatest predictions, once he really started to understand his own theory, was that whales evolved from land animals. Now, this remained rather a dubious prediction for Darwin for a long time. It wasn't until, I believe, in the 1980s when a group out of Michigan, and I'm going to forget the fellow's name, and I shouldn't, but a group out of Michigan took an expedition to Pakistan and found this marvelous fossil known as Pakicetus. Now, Pakicetus is very wolf-like in nature, okay? But Pakicetus gave rise to Ambulocetus, which is now starting to exhibit features much more typical of an aquatic animal as opposed to a pure land animal. And I'm going to skip a couple of these and go down to Basilosaurus. Basilosaurus is one of the most prominent fossil finds in the world. People find fossils for Basilosaurus all over the place. And there's a place, let's see, which, it's immediately south of the Mediterranean, that desert region there, that is referred to as the Valley of the Whales. And here we've got a desert, but it's called the Valley of the Whales. Why would this be? Well, of course, at one time that area was covered by water, and it's thought that this particular area was a region where a number of the Basilosauruses would go to die. So much like elephants tend to have a particular area that they prefer to go to die. Okay, apparently these organisms did similar things. Okay, you can literally go there and see the vertical columns of these massive organisms sticking up out of the sand. They're that numerous that it's relatively easy to find. And of course, ultimately gave rise to modern-day whales and dolphins, porpoises, etc. Now, the other thing to note, and I suspect that this is probably what really drove Darwin to make his conclusion, is that when you observe the way whales and dolphins swim, they swim by moving their vertical column up and down as opposed to the way a fish does side to side. Okay, so why would whales swim moving their fluke up and down? Well, if you think about the way land animals run, okay, they're going to what? Bring their front paws back and bring their hind legs forward, flexing their spine, and then go this way, right? So this is how land animals are going to move, okay, as opposed to the way fish move, which is again flexing the vertical column side to side. And so if we examine the fossil record again for whale evolution, here's Pakicetus. So again, this is that wolf-like creature. And note that the nostril, or the nasal cavity is at the point of the snout. As evolution continues, here's Rhodocetus, so note the migration. And then finally, here's the modern gray whale with the blowhole up the top of the head. Then, another fascinating aspect about whale anatomy is that they still have pelvic bones. But the pelvis is no longer attached to the vertebral column. We simply have the pelvic bones being in the right position, okay, where they would normally be if we were going to develop legs at that point. But they're so, they've become such remnants of evolution that they no longer even attach to the vertebral column. Embryology, fascinating topic in itself, but there's an entire field out there that's referred to as Evo-Devo. That is the evolution of development. And what you're looking at in this particular photograph is a dolphin embryo. Okay. And if we look carefully, what we see is a hind limb bud. Now, how do we know that's a hind limb bud? How do we know that? Well, once in a while, and it's quite rare, but once in a while, dolphins will develop an extra pair of fins immediately adjacent to the fluke. Okay? And that would be precisely where you would expect hind limbs to develop. So normally this gets absorbed, okay, back into the embryo during development. And unless you knew when to look, okay, or had enough specimens to compare to one another, you would never see that hind limb bud. Okay, so most of the time this is simply resorbed and does not develop into any type of structure at all. Another interesting remnant that we find in is human Lanugo. Okay, so what you're looking at is a fetus. Jane could probably tell me about how old this fetus is. Maybe about 6 to 7 months, would you say, Jane, perhaps? Okay. But anyway, regardless of how old, the poor little guy needs a shave. Okay, so why would this developing human embryo, okay, have all this developing hair on it that then is subsequently lost prior to birth? Well, it makes perfect sense when we think about humans having ape-like ancestors. Because, of course, the ape-like ancestors were going to retain this facial hair upon birth, rather than having it be lost prior to parturition. Another interesting example with human development. When we examine very early fetal development in humans, what we find attached to the amniotic sac is an empty yolk sac. What in the world are human embryos doing with a yolk sac, okay, especially if it's empty? Well, of course, this begs a question. Are there yolk protein genes in the human genome? And the answer is yes, but they're broken. Okay, they're no longer functional. Okay, so there are 3 of these broken yolk proteins that have been retained through the course of human evolution. Vitamin C. Now, I think everyone in this room is well aware that you must, as humans, take in vitamin C, otherwise you develop the vitamin deficiency known as scurvy. because when we examine the span of vertebrate animals, the vast majority don't. They make their own vitamin C. Okay, so why do we as humans have to take in vitamin C as part of our diet? Well, the key is that there is a series of 5 enzymes in the liver that can produce vitamin C just from ordinary sugars. So what happened to we humans? Well, we lack the final enzyme in this pathway called guanylactone oxidase, or GLO, which is what I'm going to refer to it from now on. Okay, but creationists or ID advocates will claim that there is no reason why design has to be perfect. Well, okay, that's actually fair enough. But the problem is we're not exactly missing the gene for GLO. It's present on chromosome 8, pretty much in the identical position we find it in other vertebrates that have a functioning GLO gene. Okay. And so the problem is that our copy has undergone so many mutations that it no longer works. Okay, so confronted with this, ID proponents will say that the designer originally gave us a functioning copy which became dysfunctional in the course of human history. But in that statement is where we got it. Okay, now why do we have them? Well, here's why. Because when we look at our closest relatives, okay, New World, Old World monkeys, gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, all of those organisms lack the same gene. So it wasn't that humans lost it. Okay, it was lost much, much earlier. When we look at a group known as prosimians still have it. Okay, when we look at the majority of other mammals, they still have it. Okay? This gene was lost about 45 million years ago in the course of the evolution of primates. Biogeography. Now, islands that arise de novo from the ocean floor, that is, volcanic islands, lack endemic mammals, amphibians, and freshwater fish. And again, this should make perfect sense to most anyone. But creationists aren't just most anyone. They'll argue that they are not there because the islands aren't suitable. Well, of course, this is easily demonstrably not true. For example, the animals that ate Hawaii, okay, the Indian mongoose and the cane toad, huge pest problems in the Hawaiian Islands. The Indian mongoose has just about driven to extinction one of the native duck species on the island, and the cane toad is just a general nuisance that forces animals out of their normal ecological niches. Other biogeography examples. So plants, birds, and insects, we always find those on islands. Gosh, isn't that amazing that they're the ones that can fly? Also, distribution of continental animals is part of biogeography. For example, we find penguins in the Antarctic, but not in the Arctic, even though the Arctic would be a perfectly suitable habitat for them. Almost all the marsupials are found in Australia. And the extinction of a number of primitive mammals occurred in South America once the Panama Isthmus was established. So eutherian mammals, that is placental mammals, primarily evolved in North America, okay, and Asia, Africa, whereas the marsupials evolved originally in South America and Australia, which at one time were the same landmass. Okay, they split apart. Then, when North America joined with South America, the eutherian mammals migrated migrated into South America and literally wiped out the marsupials in South America. The primary survivor is the good old possum. Then, bad design. So this was another prediction that we made, that would be a hallmark of evolution and not of intelligent design or creationism. So the prostate gland. Okay, unfortunately, I'm starting to learn about the prostate gland. But it's prone to swelling around a collapsible pipe, the urethra. Now, this makes absolutely no sense from a creationist point of view, but it makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective, because we understand that the prostate actually evolved from the urethra itself. Then, I don't suppose there's anybody that's ever had any back problems in this room, or any sinus issues, or ever experienced your eyes blind spot. So let's take a look at why we probably have evolved into those problems, shall we say. So if we look at an ape-like creature, so of course apes will perform what we describe as knuckle walking. So they'll support their backs with forelimbs, not two. Okay, so we're going to have this region of this organism much more well supported than we do now that we're standing upright. Okay? Also, think about sinus drainage. Okay, so here we are, okay, a nice slant to the skull, okay, allowing the sinuses to drain much more readily than they do again with us standing upright. And the eye. The eye, of course, is oftentimes held up by creationists as the ultimate organ. I've heard that many, many times. How can you have anything more perfect than the human eye? Well, there'd be a lot of ways, actually. So let's take a look at some ways we can improve things. Okay, so I've oftentimes equated this as someone trying to build a TV by putting the wiring in front of the picture tube. Okay, so that'd be kind of the equivalent here. So if we look at the retinal layer, okay, of course the retinal layer is comprised of the rods and cones, which carry out the photosensing aspects of vision. But this being our light path, okay, here's the wiring for the retinal layer in front of the retinal layer. Okay, literally blocking the light path, okay, or at least some of the light that would actually be able to reach the rods and cones if we had simply, shall we say, designed the wiring behind the retina rather than in front. Okay? So again, this is wired backwards from the way anyone that would be intelligently designing this would do it. And finally, natural selection itself. Okay, so what we should be able to observe in nature, okay, are real-time examples of natural selection. It's oftentimes, again, put forward by creationists that we don't observe real-time examples. But in fact, we do. And one of the best ones was what Darwin originally described in the form of the Galapagos finches. An excellent book that describes this in excellent detail from a modern perspective is The Beak of the Finch. And then more than 300 other cases have been described by natural selection, by John Elder in his book, Natural Selection in the Wild. But my favorite real-time example comes from the immune system. Now, I apologize if a lot of you aren't familiar with some of the aspects of the immune system. I've practiced this part of the talk many times, hoping that I can explain it well. So let's give it a whirl. One of the key players in the immune system is a protein known as an antibody or an immunoglobulin. Now, antibodies have the unique property of being able to very specifically bind to foreign proteins that enter your body. Okay, whether they be in the form of viruses or bacterial cells or toxins or, unfortunately, pollen grains. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the source is. Okay, if it's a foreign protein, you have the potential to produce an antibody against it and eliminate it. Now, an antibody is comprised of 4 protein chains. So 2 of the chains, which are identical, are described as the heavy chains. And the other 2 chains, which are also identical with each other, are described as the light chains. Now, they're held together by what's described as these disulfide bonds. And that's all I'm going to say about them. Just realize that that's the glue that holds these various protein chains together. The functional component of the antibody molecule is this antigen binding site. Now, the antigen binding site is made up of what's described as a variable region. And by that, I mean if we sequenced 100 different antibody molecules, what we would find is that these regions labeled in the light blue would all be very similar, if not identical. Whereas these regions, okay, on the heavy chains and these regions on the light chains would all exhibit a different amino acid sequence. And oftentimes very different. Okay? So we refer to this region as the variable region and these regions as the constant region. That's the variable regions that do the elimination of the antigens. Okay, so here's our antigen binding site contributed by the heavy chain. Here's the antigen binding site contributed by the light chain. Okay, so great, but what does this have to do with evolution? Okay, so when we examine how the immune system responds to a foreign antigen, here's in essence the first step, shall we say. So we have constantly circulating in our bodies a huge population of B cells, all of which express on their surface a unique antibody molecule. Okay, those antibody molecules get selected by the offending antigenic determinant. So in this case, this red antigenic determinant is specific for this B cell. When that B cell is stimulated, it starts to undergo division and expands itself. Okay, that is, we start to increase that particular allelic population. And then subsequently, they differentiate into cells that secrete lots and lots of these antibody molecules, and those antibody molecules eventually result, hopefully, in the elimination of the antigen. But there's just a little bit more to the story. Okay? And this is where it fits in so nicely in real time with what anyone can observe from any vertebrate's immune system. And this process has a nice fancy name to it. It's called antibody affinity maturation. But what I want to point out here is this. The B cell up here typically has a relatively poor fit with the antigen that's coming in. Okay? That is, it has a low affinity interaction. Okay? The goal of the immune response is to improve that fit, okay, with the idea of being able to more effectively eliminate the antigen from the system. So how does it do this? Well, we start again with our low affinity B cell, and here's our variable heavy and variable light region, remember, that's going to bind our antigen. And note that at this point, the fit is not very good. So what happens as the immune response matures? The B cells themselves undergo mutation within these variable regions. These mutations lead to new binding pockets for the antigen. Most of those binding pockets will no longer fit the antigen very well at all. And those B cells die off. They're not selected for. They die off. The ones that have an improved fit are selected for. Those undergo further expansion, start producing more antibodies that fit the antigen better, and start to eliminate the antigen at a faster rate. But that's still not quite the end, because this forms a loop. So we get this recycling back and forth between mutation, selection, ever higher affinity, until finally the antigen is fully eliminated. So evolution in real time. Okay? Because what we end up with, okay, in this last high affinity B cell, is a sequence of DNA that can be found nowhere else in your genome. It's new, novel DNA. Again, something that creationists will say simply doesn't happen, and I get to pull out the bullshit sting. Okay, because it does. Okay, so let's wrap up here, and then we'll go to questions. So, summary of evidence for evolution. So, the fossil record, vestigial organs and accompanying pseudogenes, quirks of development, bad design, biogeography, and examples of natural selection in real time. Now, things that would falsify evolution. So creationists often claim that evolution is equivalent to a number of religious claims. That is, it is not falsifiable. But here's a list of things that would falsify it. Okay, so fossils in the wrong place. Okay, if we don't observe this. A general lack of genetic variation in species, but in fact we find a great deal of genetic variation in species. Adaptations that could not have evolved by a step-by-step process of ever-increasing fitness, that is, ID's claim of irreducible complexity. Adaptations that would be adverse for individuals, but good for populations. Evolved altruistic behavior among non-relatives and non-social animals. And finally, discordance between phylogenies based on morphology fossils and on DNA. And the bottom line to that list is that we've never observed any of these. So, what does all this mean? It's true. Okay? Evolution really is true. And this is a very gradual change that we can believe in. Thanks so much for your attention. Happy to entertain questions. So, yeah, Clay?
Try to use the mics if you can. They should, if you push the button and the green light is on, it might will work, supposedly.
I'll give it a try. I don't think the mic is working, is it? I'll use my big voice.
There you go.
Thank you, Brad. Early on, I think you said that the theory of evolution is not complete, that we lack a complete understanding of the mechanisms of evolution. Where do you think we still need to explore, and what missing elements are there in our understanding?
Okay, that's a great question. What I had prepared for, okay, so where do I think we can improve? Certainly, it would be great to have more intermediate fossils. Okay, we all know, or at least I'm sure a majority of the people in this room know the difficulty in producing fossils in the first place. But having more intermediate fossils would be great. We're kind of overcoming some of that with the ability to sequence ancient DNA. Okay, so that is one thing, one route to try to overcome that lack. Let's see, some other things.
How about horizontal gene transfer and the role of viruses?
Sure.
Do we understand that, Bob?
We certainly understand what it is. I don't think we have a good, thorough understanding of what transfers have occurred when. Again, being able to sequence ancient DNA will help with those types of things. A horizontal gene transfer, again, just in case some of the audience members aren't familiar with that. Okay, so horizontal gene transfer means that you acquire DNA in some fashion from your environment. The most frequent route would be a virus infecting cells that ultimately reaches the germline, okay, such that they can then be passed on to further generations. In fact, the human genome is about 50% retrovirus sequence, which was one of the more astonishing things that was discovered when the human genome was sequenced. So that's what we mean by horizontal gene transfer, is the acquisition of DNA from environmental sources. Yes?
You mentioned you wish you had more intermediate fossils. That's a very common criticism that creationists have for evolution. Wishing it isn't going to make it happen, of course. How do you have a quick, snappy, or whatever answer for that very common criticism? Why aren't there more intermediate fossils?
Sure, fossils are hard to make. I mean, that's literally, we have lots of
fossils, so that's
yeah, I mean, we have plenty of fossils, sure. And we have lots of very good transitional fossils. Okay, so yeah, that's the other thing I point out. I say, well, where would you like to see more transitional fossils? And typically the answer that they'll give is there's no such thing as transitional fossils. And they just see everything as its own unique species. So when, for example, what would be described as a transitional fossil is discovered and presumably fills a gap between A and B, they say, oh no, now you've formed two more gaps. You see what I'm saying? So fossil B now goes in between what was A and B previously, now is A and C, and they see it as two gaps now rather than one. Okay, so there's obviously no pleasing that group when it comes to the aspect of transitional fossils. Yes?
I think we've all had a conversation at one point or another with someone who, due to various differences in understanding of how the universe works, we realize we're not going to get anywhere with the conversation. We say, well, let's just let it go. What harm does it do? Broadly speaking, if Joe Average, guy working in marketing, is a fervent believer in creationism, what harm does that do?
Well, it depends. Does he want to run for your local school board? Okay, or is he perfectly happy in his own beliefs and keeping his own beliefs to himself and not trying to adulterate scientific education? Okay, so that is one component. But another would be voting issues. So perhaps this individual does not understand why an annual flu vaccination is a good idea. Okay, and so suddenly now this starts to spill over into potential health problems. Okay. That to me is why it's important for the general populace to have a feel for what evolution is and what it's all about. And so those types of things is where we could have problems arise. Yes.
Well, wouldn't a good counter argument be simply, well, where do new flu viruses come from? Or how does antibiotic resistance occur if there's no change ever, if everything's static?
Right.
That's certainly a very simple argument that most people can understand.
Right, and of course the typical rejoinder there is, well, I accept microevolution, but I don't accept macroevolution. But the problem with that so-called argument is that the same mechanisms that give rise to microevolution, and I don't like that term, period. I simply refuse to use it because evolution is evolution. When you have mutation followed by selection, that is evolution at work. That would typically be their response. Well, yeah, of course, microevolution works, so they pretty much have to accept that because it's just too easy to demonstrate. You can demonstrate that with a high school experiment. Yes.
You no doubt have a lot of experience debating with creationists and experiencing creationist tactics and all that sort of thing. One thing you're probably aware of is the creationist movement was ironically evolve.
Like I said, creationism 2.0 is intelligent design.
Intelligent design, as a term, did not exist before, I don't know, about 5 years before Kitzmiller versus Dover. And then there was a bunch of journals that, promptly, dried up when the media stopped paying attention to them. So what do you see as the next iteration of the creationist movement? I mean, like, what adjective, noun combination, like intelligent design, are we going to see next? And what kind of tactics are going to go along with that?
Well, the major approach now, I would say, is to try to use pop culture. So if you take a look at the Creation Museum, for example, okay, the Creation Museum is an amusement park, and it really is. I mean, you go in there and you've got all these animated animals and all of this stuff that provides a great show. Okay? So the use of pop culture, the use of technology in those aspects is where a lot of this is gone. And it's my understanding that the art that Ken Ham is building is going to be the same way. It's all going to be mechanical animals and people and that type of thing. So that would be one route. But fortunately, technology has also had the opposite effect. And technology has really helped out the cause of evolution, and it has made people aware of a lot of the tactics that creationists use, simply because people will look things up on the internet and go, yeah, I've heard that. I've seen that. So that has worked, shall we say, in our favor as well. Yeah, Tim?
Well, and it goes to what I believe is that if you really, the only way to combat that as creationists is to do a better job in elementary, middle school, high school, of educating our kids. Because what they're doing with the Christian Museum is targeting kids.
Sure, absolutely.
And,
Sure.
And it goes back to teacher preparation too, because you survey teachers how a lot of teachers just aren't comfortable with it. They're informed, not taught, enlightened. And so that's where it's
Yeah,
we want to change
absolutely.
that. The only way to find it is to reverse that.
Okay, way in the back.
Are we seeing evolution in the catastrophic effects of the Zika virus and the birth of microcephalic babies?
Hey, probably not evolution so much as the exposure to new ecological niches. And so one of the problems with that we have, say, with deforestation or agricultural use of territory that previously was not under such use, is the exposure of individuals to new viruses that were previously just hanging out in that region of the world. And so most likely that is the origin of Zika virus, and not as a result of an evolutionary leap, shall we say, that now makes it compatible with humans. It's probably just that humans previously were not exposed to the virus, and by some ecological mechanism became exposed. Okay, let's see. You were next. Yes.
Yeah, I don't are familiar with it, but the bovine coronavirus, especially in the sand hills, pardon me, it's a virus that causes diarrhea in cattle, and it does have a, what do you call it? Mild forms of it can exist in an animal over winter. It has to, because animals, it's pretty difficult to find an animal at 6 months old that isn't immune to it. And so you have a carrier state. But what you see in the spring is that this RNA virus, calves are exposed to a low dose of it and will have perhaps a 0 to 10% mortality in the spring. But as calves are born through the early part of the spring, that virus mutates rapidly and goes to sometimes 100% mortality by the time you hit June.
Yeah.
And then the only way it can survive over winter again is that all of the virulent forms die off, or in effect, and only the very modestly virulent forms will overwinter without eliciting an immune response.
Right. Yeah, so that's actually my area of expertise is virology. I got my Ph.D. in virology from Baylor College of Medicine. But yeah, viruses obviously represent very rapidly evolving organisms. And in particular, RNA viruses, and there's a good reason for this. When RNA viruses replicate their nucleic acid, they lack in the process of copying one RNA strand to another, they lack the ability to carry out any proofreading. So if a mistake is made, the mistake stays in there. Okay, as opposed to DNA, okay, the enzymes that make DNA have the ability to remove mistakes. Okay, that doesn't mean that DNA gets copied perfectly, because it doesn't. Not every mistake is caught, but it's about 1,000,000-fold better than RNA viruses. Okay, so RNA viruses can mutate at a very high rate. Okay, so if you are a virus like a coronavirus that is pleomorphic, that is, its morphology or shape is rather plastic. Okay, it's not a highly rigid type of structure, but there's more flexibility in the structure. So if you have that flexibility, then just like influenza, you can create new strains every season. Okay, whereas if you're more restricted, like poliovirus, which we're all thankful poliovirus is more restricted, you can eliminate that. We're on the verge of eliminating poliovirus from the world, okay, through vaccination. Whereas it's doubtful we'll ever eliminate influenza from the world, and for the very reasons that I just described. Yeah.
I was just wondering, would you see anti-evolution as being just one part of the anti-science, anti-global warming, anti-vaccination?
Sure. Yeah, although it's interesting that anti-evolution and anti-science tend to be more from the right, whereas anti-vaccination tends to be more from the left. Okay, so it's rather interesting how that falls. And again, it's politically motivated oftentimes there too. Yeah, you and then I'll come to you. Okay, go ahead.
Connected to Gary's question, I'm wondering if is the root of resistance to accepting evolution and general desire not to have naturalistic explanations, thus clearing the field for the supernatural.
Right, I think it is. That's certainly a big part of it. Also, you know, it's interesting when you really, and I've tried to do this as openly as I can with some people. But it's interesting that the major objection typically comes when you move the topic to human evolution. And a lot of people are fine with animal evolution, you know, but if you call people animals, which of course we are, okay, but if you move the conversation to human evolution, that's when, you know, the hairs on the back of the neck stick up, shall we say. And so it's interesting that, you know, there's kind of a dichotomy even in the objectors' line of argumentation. Yes.
I think you must have set me up for this somehow, because my question was specifically whether you had any comments about human evolution, especially in the context of us talking about natural selection, because we have the ability to mess that natural part up. So, any thoughts on that, long or short term?
Right. So a key aspect, and this kind of goes back to an earlier question we had. A key aspect or a key reason for understanding evolution is to try to control it. Okay, so do we really want to be naturally selected at the rate that we may be facing from climate change? I don't want that type of selective force to be in my near future. Okay, so that would be an aspect of why it's important to understand evolution. Okay, is to actually be able to control it. Should we allow, for example, modern medicine to be a part of preventing the selection of individuals that would die without it? Okay, that's heavy. And so that would, you know, address your question, I think. Okay. Yes, and then that'll come to you. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Very early in your talk, I think it was the second slide, you showed the graph of 24 countries and US were number 23. They were almost all European countries, Judeo-Christian background, except one, Japan. That's another one. Number 24 was Turkey, which is the only Muslim country that was up there. And I wonder if you or maybe anybody in this room, for that matter, could comment on how does evolution stand in Hindu cultures and Chinese and especially Muslim cultures. Is there data on that?
I can speak a little bit to Muslim cultures. There's a very prominent creationist book that's been published by a Muslim, and I don't recall the person's name. But I've actually seen photographs from this book. It's all over the internet. So in terms of, and he's from Turkey, by the way, the author of that book. So I know creationism is alive and well in the Islamic culture. Chinese, I suspect, probably more from government mandates than anything, is not creationist. And you know, as to Hindu, that's a good question. I've visited with people from India, but I've never actually brought up that topic. So next time I will.
Wikipedia says it's varied.
Varied? Okay.
Like everything else in Hinduism.
Yeah, right. Okay, way back. Yes.
Do you feel comfortable telling us anything about the extent of the resistance you run into in your undergraduate classes in Kearney?
Okay. Interestingly enough, I've been there 27 years and have had only one serious incident where a student was really, really opposed. And in fact, he was what I would call a stealther. He wasn't actually a biology major, he was a physics major. And he signed up for the class at the beckoning of some local pastors because let's face it, I'm known as the infidel of Kearney. And so this individual signed up for my evolution course, and it didn't take long for it to become obvious what his views were. And I eventually had to take him aside in my office and say, if you want to stay in the course, here's what you have to do. And basically I told him, your creationist stuff just has to remain silent. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wonder if he had a biblical alternative explanation for physics.
He was a big Kent Hovind fan. Okay, who, appropriately enough, is still languishing in prison for tax evasion, which I hope Ken Ham will eventually get found out for that. I think he's probably there's a pretty good chance. But anyway, that's where that was his primary source of objectionary material. So what I was teaching was from Kent Hovind.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
How do you address the, I was interested, I attended a lecture a few years ago in Kenneth Miller.
Oh, yeah, Ken Miller.
In Darwin, in Search for Darwin's God. And he did an excellent job to fill off this book, but then his last 3 or 4 chapters were very strongly trying to prove that God was behind evolution as far as the creation, et cetera, et cetera. How do you deal, or do you deal, and with that type of an individual?
Right. So in essence, Ken Miller is obviously a very strong advocate for evolutionary education. I've read at least one of his books. And in fact, some of the material I presented on vitamin C was from some of his arguments. But it's hard for me to understand someone like Ken Miller because when you think about what it means to be a scientist or how you have to approach questions as a scientist, okay, how is it that in some way you're going to let those rigid rules by which the rest of science is done fall by the wayside when it comes to trying to reconcile your religious beliefs with what we know is true concerning evolution? Why would you want to invoke an unnecessary step when you know full well that it is indeed unnecessary? And so it's just very difficult for me to understand someone like Ken Miller.
Is there a reconciliation? I mean, I always looked at it from the standpoint of the science. I can prove the science, okay? And when I try to prove God or disprove God, is just, I mean, they're both essentially impossible. So is there a reconciliation between, I mean, lots of famous scientists, go back to, that have developed science within the monasteries, et cetera, genetics, and so.
Can I comment on?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, please.
Okay. Ken Miller is a very staunch defender of evolution and the science of evolution. But I think he's a good example of what Stephen Jay Gould referred to as the non-overlapping magisterium.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
Yep. Elaborate on that. Oh, and by the way, if everybody would use the mic. Can you get to that?
The microphones are working tonight.
I can hear you through the mic a little bit.
No.
How about it?
Mic is not working. The mic is off.
Yes.
I made a comment on that. This is Finding Darwin's God, right? Is that the book you're talking about? Is that the book you read?
That's not the book I read. I think the book I read was entitled Only a Theory by Ken Miller.
Okay. That's his chapter 9. I use this in a couple of classes of mine. It ends up with a lot of discussion it's the last chapter, and he says, God got it all wrong. Essentially, we, as a class, kind of agreed that he has a sort of a deistic philosophy. That God said, let there be that, and then science took over from there. It seems to be the way that he reconciles his own Catholicism with a very good cell biologist, a very well-recognized co-evolution professor at Brown University, microbiologist.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, I personally find that as an untenable dichotomy, but anyway.
it's like he wants it both ways.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, who's next? Yeah, go ahead.
I just got to know, did that student drop the class?
He did not.
What grade did he get?
He got an A minus. So yeah, it makes no difference to me what somebody's personal views are in terms of taking one of my courses. That's none of my business, actually, when it comes down to it. But if you're going to vocalize those views, you can bet I'm going to criticize them. I gave a talk on flood, which he didn't really like. Anyway.
Well,
Any others?
well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for being here. So